Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to Portland. Beautiful sunny day in Portland with a little feedback. We like feedback, contact, feedback. Okay, good morning. I'm Doug. I'm former Oregon State on behalf of Fourth State, I'm delighted to say more to welcome to our legislation. And we're here, our audience here on campus with the Smith Memorial student people, and to more than 300 plus viewers who are watching by live stream today from across the country and beyond. So thank you all for being here in person today and for joining us online as well. I want to thank the Aspen Institute for bringing this America's Rural Opportunity Forum here to the West Coast in Portland. And special thanks to partners, Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition, the Rural Development Innovation Group, Rural Resources, and the U.S. Forest Service for helping make today possible. You'll hear a little more on the here in a moment. The Head Federal Government Director, Bureau Yoshida, was called effectively at the last moment. Can't join us today, but I know Bureau would want to remind us that Senator Hatfield's legacy was built on the integration and the independence of rural Oregon, and that the senator's acts of listening and showing respect and really of seeking collaboration and accepting compromise is highly relevant to the kind of challenges that face in our natural resource world today here in the West and across the country. Portland State, we're really pleased to be a connector of urban and rural and to be a source of teaching and practice around collaboration through our National Policy Consensus Center here as well as through the Hatfield School of Government. So I hope that you will make yourself at home here on campus today. It is finals week, so it might be a little bit quiet. And I hope you can also join us for lunch and informal conversation at the close of the panel.
Good morning to the Pacific Time Zone, and good afternoon to most of the rest of you watching from afar. Welcome to this 10th in the series America's Rural Opportunity, and our second on the road. I'm Catherine Ferguson. I'm Associate Director of Aspen Institute Community Strategies Group. Aspen CSG connects, motivates, equips leaders and doers across the country to build more prosperous regions and to advance those living on the economic margins. Aspen CSG, since our founding in 1985, has focused most of our work on rural America. The America's Rural Opportunity Series is the product of partnership between Aspen Community Strategies Group and the Rural Development Innovation Group. The Rural Development Innovation Group is a group of 16 seasoned practitioners, intermediaries, and funders deeply engaged in rural economic development across the United States. DIG has several aims. Those include lifting up a rural opportunity agenda by surfacing and sharing innovative approaches to strengthen families, economies, and communities. They also are aimed at trying to increase understanding of what's working and why, so that we can accelerate and start creative and more proven approaches to rural places. You can find more about the Rural Development Innovation Group online on Aspen Community Strategies website. This America's Rural Opportunity Series is one way that the Rural Development Innovation Group is lifting up what is working to build prosperity in rural economies and to help low-income people, places, and firms do better at the same time. We normally hold these events at the Aspen Institute offices in Washington, D.C. But today, we're on the road because last year the Rural Innovation Development Group said we want to take the show on the road. And so in September, we held our first event on the road in Athens, Ohio, Appalachian, Ohio, and today we're here in Portland, Oregon, the outpost of the Pacific Northwest. As Doug noted, 4 organizations are co-hosting today's event, so we have a large cast of characters involved in today's show. I want to take a minute and introduce a couple of them. Karen Hardig, right here, is the Executive Director of the Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition. And Nils Christofferson is the Executive Director with Wallowa Resources, a member of the Rural Development Innovation Group, and also sits on the Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition team. You already met Doug Decker with the Portland State University's Hatfield School of Government. So together we've put on this event, and we're so glad you've tuned in and are here in person as well. Before we forge ahead, I want to say a few words about Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition and why we're holding this event together. Created in 2001, today RVCC is a coalition of more than 80 partners, nonprofit, private, public, across the West, that have a shared commitment to finding common ground and building solutions that meet diverse interests. RVCC's sweet spot is the nexus between natural resource management and rural development, which are, of course, inextricably linked. Most of our panelists have participated in the coalition for many years, And you can learn more about RVCC on their website, which is ruralvoicescoalition.org. On a personal note, I'd say that I did have the opportunity to attend RVCC's annual meeting in Santa Fe earlier this year. And I had an aha moment about the importance of collaboration and local institutions in the West. The stories that RVCC members told of millions of acres of rivers and mountains and industries gone belly up really underscored the complexity and scale. The geographies across the West, as you know, are vast, and the issues are just too large for one entity to tackle on their own. I'm from Colorado, and so I knew this in my bones. But hearing people from RVCC tell their stories really helped me make the connection around the implications of this scale and complexity for policy. So always, but especially in the West, community and economic development and land management are intertwined. And thus today's session will focus on just that, the intersection of land stewardship and community and economic development. What you will hear today illustrates 3 investment principles that I want you to just think about as we continue. One is that investment in entrepreneurial local people, local institutions, and firms is just as important as capital investment. A second is that short-term investments will not yield long-term desired results. And finally, place-rooted, collaborative, intermediary organizations are essential to successful rural community and economic development. You will likely hear the term collaborative stewardship, so I want to take a minute to define it, and then we'll begin to forge ahead. Drawing from the U.S. Forest Service's definition, collaborative stewardship is a process of scientists, government, and citizens working together through open dialogue to agree and attain goals and objectives that are environmentally responsible, socially acceptable, and economically viable. Today, we will hear from several collaborative stewardship action heroes about how they are working to build a better West. We want to start with some data, and that will ground us in the reality of the West and the challenges facing communities. For that, we will turn to RVCC partner and friend of Aspen CSG, Headwaters Economics, and the Resources and Communities Research Group. I want to pause and thank again the U.S. Forest Service for supporting and underwriting this particular ARO session. Let me also mention, we have handouts on your chair, and there's also a link on our Rural Opportunity webpage where you can download the presentation that you're about to see, and also you can learn more about today's speakers and co-hosts. If you would like to share your thoughts on today's discussion, or you want to send a question for our panel, we're using the hashtag Rural Innovation. To learn more, get updates, share your stories of rural innovation, you can visit us at as.pn/rural. And you can also follow us on Twitter at Rural Innovators. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Haggerty with Headwaters Economics.
Thank you, Catherine. It is a real pleasure to be here. This is my first Aspen Institute event, and I know RVCC quite well, and it is a wonderful group of folks, and I always learn as much or more, hopefully, than I contribute. So my job is to share a little bit of information about the context that we're talking about. What's unique about the West? The first thing to know is that the West is more than half public lands, state and federal lands. And that has really shaped the relationship between communities and natural resources, particularly starting after World War II, when extraction of coal and oil and gas and timber and grazing from public lands really fueled the post-war economic boom, and communities grew up around these public lands and access to natural resources. But the presence of public lands also complicates management in some pretty significant ways. Public lands are fragmented, often in a checkerboard style between different owners who have different mandates, different constituents, and different regulations that they have to follow. For example, state lands are largely managed to generate revenue for public schools in the West. You have BLM, Bureau of Land Management, and Forest Service lands, which in the majority are managed for multiple uses, which include commodity extraction, recreation, and conservation. We also have protected wilderness areas, national wildlife refuges, and national parks that are managed very differently. And then we have sovereign nations, the tribes, who are managing very large tracts of their own reservations, but also have very real interests in public lands as well. And the reason that that's important is it's very difficult for local communities to understand and navigate how all these competing interests affect their opportunities and the role of public lands in their local economies. And that confusion and sometimes difficulty in navigating is becoming ever more hard to reconcile given the changes in the economy. And so as we have a legacy of extraction which has really changed the social contract in ways that is constraining the ability to use public lands for extractive activities, we've also had a tax revolt and restructuring in rural communities, which is putting significant pressure on public lands to strip away regulations and to maximize the use of commodities from these places. And so this push and pull factor has only increased the complexity and difficulty for communities to try to understand and work with public lands. So what I want to do next is just talk a little bit about those changes in the economy and what it means for the collaboratives. And collaborative efforts in these places are really driving the innovation and trying to resolve some of these difficult challenges. So the first thing to know is that since the recession, the US economy has been doing great. We have had monthly income and employment gains consecutively since about 2010. The West is the fastest growing region of the country, and the Pacific Northwest in particular is growing faster than even the West is as a whole. So as a regional perspective, we're doing great. We're growing quickly. The nature of that growth has really changed. We've seen a dramatic shift away from manufacturing and natural resource sectors to services, and the most important of those services are these high-wage innovation sectors, which almost all require a higher degree, and they have multipliers. They're driving growth in the West. The other big change is in the nature of how people are being compensated. The growth of non-labor income, largely through dividends, interest, and rent, is one of the biggest trends in the West that is often not captured by a lot of the normal economic pundits. And as we think about the growth of non-labor income, it's important to understand what it is and how it actually contributes to growth in other sectors like construction and healthcare and finance. So this change in the structure of the economy has big implications for the geography of the West. A lot of these high-wage service jobs are agglomerating in cities where they have access to capital, they have access to creative, like-minded companies and an educated workforce. Nearly all of the new jobs in the West since the recession have located in cities, and just 3 cities in the Pacific Northwest are responsible for almost 3/4 of all the new jobs and income: Seattle, Portland, and Boise. For the rural counties, 69% of them have not recovered the jobs that they lost during the recession. So we're starting to see a big divergence in the types of places that are doing well. In the West, we think about connection to metros as being one of the most important characteristics that determines your prospects. So it's not about urban and rural. There are a lot of non-metro places that are connected to cities that are actually growing and participating in the kind of growth that's happening in the cities. Bozeman, Montana, where I'm from, we're not a metro, but we are growing like crazy, and a lot of my neighbors and colleagues work in high-tech and innovation sectors, and they're largely based in cities like Seattle and Portland or San Jose, but they live in Montana for a variety of reasons. The isolated places, or what my wife, Julia Haggerty at Montana State University, is starting to call the Third West, they're not participating in those types of jobs because they don't have access to cities, they don't have the educated labor force. They're also suffering from restructuring and automation in traditional sectors. And so they are falling behind. They are losing jobs, and wages are largely stagnant in these places. The Great Divergence describes this trend where increases in productivity in the economy are no longer translating into higher wages and more employment opportunities. So for example, in the Pacific Northwest, through the 90s, we lost a significant number of jobs in the timber industry. 3/4 of those jobs, or 2/3 of those jobs, were lost due to automation and consolidation in timber mills and increasing productivity of working in the woods. So we just simply don't need as many people to do that work. That was overshadowed by the change in federal management, but it's a really important trend that we're seeing across manufacturing and natural resource sectors, and what it means is that a return to commodity production no longer is going to provide the kind of value proposition for rural communities that it used to. And we need to rethink where that value proposition lies. So we took a close look at all of the communities, these are counties in the Pacific Northwest that were dependent on timber, measured as 20% of personal income, labor income from timber sector in the late 70s, early 80s, and then we looked at them again today. And what we found, remarkably, was that there's very little legacy of timber in their economic performance. There's no relationship between whether or not you used to be dependent on timber and how you're doing today. But actually, the performance of these places was entirely predictable. Those places that were connected to metropolitan areas, those places that had an educated labor force, and places that had natural amenities are growing. So we like to say in the office that if you have an airport, a university, and a national park, your problem is too much growth. If you don't have any of those things, you're probably not growing at all, and you might even be falling behind. But those rural places are still generating a significant amount of value. When you look at the county GDP data, half of all the counties that have high GDP per capita in the West are non-metro counties. A third of them are rural. So natural resource and commodity booms can still lift these places. There's still value being generated, but it's not translating into growth. Half of all the non-metro counties that have high GDP per capita are losing population at the same time. So value in rural communities is not translating into economic opportunity. And one of the things that we think is happening is that a lot of outside forces, the institutions and the policies that are constraining the autonomy and the authority of local communities to retain wealth and invest it back into their communities, are shaping the outcomes in these places. So for example, those same timber communities in the Pacific Northwest received substantial revenue from federal timber payments, from revenue sharing payments, and they were required to use that on an annual basis. So they weren't allowed to save it. It got spent annually, and it drove down local property tax levies. And then Oregon, like many other states in the West, had a property tax revolt. And so now they are constrained in their ability to actually change their local fiscal circumstances. And so as the revenue went away and as the volume declined, these communities had nothing to show for it. They literally go bankrupt overnight when the activity ends. And they cannot see their way to diversifying because any new economic activity doesn't pay its way because they have an anemic tax base that they have a very difficult time changing. So these outside forces are constraining the ability of these communities that are still producing wealth, still contributing to the economy, from actually getting ahead. And so the last thing I'll say is that we're starting to think about what this means for communities, and this is a model that we've started thinking about for energy-dependent communities, but I think it also works for formerly timber-dependent communities and recreation-dependent communities as well. They have these vulnerabilities that are inherent to their geography and inherent to their small size that they need to try to overcome, but they are also facing all of these outside forces that are constraining their autonomy. And in the middle is where collaboration is really driving innovation. The collaborative groups are not only teaching us how to work on the landscape in ways that are sustainable and start to rebuild an economy in these rural communities, but they're also starting to show us the way to networking and changing policy at the state and regional and federal level so that we can start to build on the success stories. And so the real challenge is when we hear success stories and you say, wow, how did that happen? What made that work in that community? It's often a story about an individual or a small group of people who were able to succeed against all the odds. So what we're trying to understand is how do we actually change the odds so that those people can do exceptional things and the rest of us can just get along and try to get ahead. And so that outside set of factors is something that I think we'll hear a lot about today and try to bring those stories forward. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. Again, I'm Karen Hardig, Director of the Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition, and I'm sure that this context will help ground the stories that we're about to hear in the broader trends. So with that, I want to get our panel started. The way the session will run is that our moderator will queue up the opening thinking and stories that each of our panelists will have present in turn, and then he will ask the group some questions to dig a little bit deeper. We'll then have a block of time at the end for questions and comments from the people here in the room and from our live stream audience. So start sharing your questions, hashtag rural innovation, whenever you have them, and we will ask them later. So I'm really pleased to introduce our moderator, Tony Chang. Tony is the director of the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute and a professor in the Department of Forest and Rangeland Stewardship at Colorado State University. Tony's expertise is in forest governance, policy, and administration, as well as collaboration. He's all about understanding what it takes to create resilient social ecological systems and shifting policy and systems to support this goal. So you can see why we asked him to moderate. So Tony is from rural Eastern Washington, also giving him some legitimate Pacific Northwest street cred. And he's also been a longtime contributor and participant to RVCC, and is someone I personally look to for advice and mentorship often. Beyond his years in school here in the Pacific Northwest, Tony's been on sabbatical here in Oregon. We're catching him in his last few days before he heads back to Colorado, and he's been working on issues related to wildfire risk reduction and cross-boundary management. So enough from me. Tony, I'm pleased to take it from here.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming and being on the live stream. The way this is going to go down, I'm going to just introduce everybody. They're going to have a chance to tell their stories from their rural places and their connection between land stewardship and community development. And then there will be kind of a structured set of question and answer that I will direct and moderate. And then at about 11:40 or so, we'll be able to open it up for broader audience participation. And those of you who are live stream again, use that Twitter hashtag Rural Innovation. So you've already heard and met and heard from Mark Haggerty with Headwaters Economics from Bozeman, Montana. And then moving to me, we have Billy Barquin, who is the Attorney General for the Kootenai Tribe of Idaho, but based here in Portland. Susan Jane Brown with the Western Environmental Law Center, and Mark Webb with Blue Mountain Forest Partners. And Susan Jane's located in Portland, but is by Cascadia, not necessarily bi-coastal, working on the west and east side. And Mark's over in northeastern Oregon. And then to my immediate right is Tony Ruth with Salmon Valley Stewardship in Idaho. So I will just kind of get things going and ask Billy, why don't you lead us off and tell us a bit about yourself, the Kootenai Tribe, and the work you have underway. And as you do so, please help us all understand what makes the Kootenai Tribe's approach to ecosystem restoration and land stewardship different. In what ways does it align with the tribal values?
Okay, thank you, Tony. Kisuk I'm Billy Barquin. I'm Eastern Shoshone and Oglala Lakota from Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, but I've represented the Kootenai Tribe of Idaho for, it'll be 20 years in November, quite a long time as a tribal attorney. Wanted to first start by acknowledging that we're in the traditional territory of the Willamette Valley tribes that now include Confederated Tribes of Siletz, Grand Round, and Warm Springs. So the Kootenai Tribe of Idaho is in very far north Idaho, about 25 miles from the border with British Columbia. KTOI, Kootenai Tribe of Idaho, is part of the Greater Tunaha Nation. There are 4 communities in British Columbia represented by the Tunaha Nation Council. There's a community over in Montana on the Flathead Reservation that's represented by the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. And we all come together as a nation to deal with territory-wide and nationwide issues. The territory is, pardon the hands, I have to do this in order to get the directions right. So North Idaho, Northeast Washington, Southeast British Columbia, Southwest Alberta, and Northwest Montana. So it's a pretty extensive territory, bifurcated, of course, by the colonial line between the US and Canada. Very rural. I think the largest town in the territory is Cranbrook, BC. It's got about 20,000 people. 20,000 population, so a very small town as far as the big city nearby, though. So the tribe, the nation as a whole, but especially the Kootenai Tribe, is governed by the covenant, and the covenant says the Creator created Tunaha people in the territory, and their job is to guard and keep the land forever. And if they do so, then the land will take care of them or forever. Of course, colonialism and settlement changed a lot. So removed Tunaha people from their traditional village sites, separated them by an international boundary, reduced access to fishing and hunting grounds, and then they started making levees along the Kootenai River. And if you're from the arid west, like I am, this is very weird, but they drain the fields and they put pumps in the fields to get water off the fields, which just doesn't seem right as far as a farming practice, but that's what they do. And then eventually, in 1974, the Libby Dam went in, and the Libby Dam then changes the river so that it's nutrient poor. And so now farmers now we actually, as the Kootenai Tribe, are putting nutrients in the river rather than getting it out. So it's a bit of a unique territory. But the extreme poverty that resulted from settlement really affected the tribe. And Kootenai tribe of Idaho-Oconquemi got down to 67 people. So in 1974, they declared war against the United States. It was a peaceful war, and it was a successful war. So as a result of the war, there was a little bit more land base. There was more economic development and economic revitalization and health services given to the tribe. And so an economic revitalization and cultural revitalization of the Kootenai tribe occurred. However, starting in 1974 with the nail of the coffin of Libby Dam, there's a decline of the native fish and wildlife for which the Kootenai have treaty resources. Kootenai River white sturgeon endangered, there's no harvest. Bull trout threatened, limited harvest. Burbot functionally extirpated. West Slope cutthroat trout threatened, limited harvest. South Arm kokanee functionally extirpated. Grizzly bear threatened. Canada lynx threatened. Caribou endangered, and just this past winter, the last of the herd from the southern portion of the territory was captured and moved north. So when we talk about catalysts for change, that was it. All the treaty resources that the tribe relied on and that were essential to Kootenai culture were nearly eliminated, or in some cases completely eliminated. At the same time, there's decreasing timber jobs in the U.S. portion of the territory especially, which is what I'll talk mostly about. And then you couple that with the fighting that occurs between tribal government versus local government versus local government, state government versus tribal government, federal government against everyone. And what occurred was just stagnation. It's like we all started fighting about who has the most jurisdiction, who has the bigger authority in this area, and nothing was happening. So everyone thought, well, there's got to be a better way than this, right? And then the tribal council, consistent with the covenant, decided to create a strategy. Okay, we need to restore the territory. We need the resources in the forests and the rivers to be healthy in order to keep the covenant. So the strategy is holistic, science-based, consistent with tribal cultural values, adaptively managed, collaborative, and inclusive of social and economic values. What the tribal council realized was, while we have a poor history between indigenous and settler communities, and that's putting it very lightly, we don't have to continue to let that define us. And settlers live in the territory, they're not going away, and we have to work with their governments or we won't get anything done. So we started working with our federal, both Canada and US, state, other tribal, provincial, First Nations and tribal governments, trying to figure out, okay, is there a different way that we can do things so we can actually accomplish something? And the most important thing we did was work with the city of Bonners Ferry, which is the town closest to the tribe, and the city of Bonners Ferry. Through a joint powers agreement, we formed the Kootenai Valley Resource Initiative. All right. And what KVRI does, and I'll get a little bit more into it, it is a way for the tribe, we get community input on our sovereign decision-making as to what should happen as far as natural resources. What the community gets is they get governments that actually listen to them. So we educate the community on the issues, we get their input as to what should this area look like, how can restore the area. And through KVRI and a number of years working together, we finally were awarded one of the programs for the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. And with that, we are actually getting a lot of work done on the ground that is finally restoring the forest and the territory, because after 100 years of colonial management of the forest and suppression of fire and everything that the misguided management did, the forests in the territory aren't healthy, which is why we also see the impacts of the treaty resources. So I'll get a little more into some of the specifics, but that's sort of how we got to where we are at Kootenai Tribe.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you very much. And again, for those of you that are thinking about some questions, we'll have some time at 11:40 to field a few questions from the audience. And again, those of you on live stream, you can send your questions in through the hashtag Rural Innovation. Susan Jane and Mark Webb, you're kind of an unlikely pairing up here, an environmental attorney and a recovering county judge from a rural county in northeastern Oregon. It seems your perspectives might be probably a little different. So why am I introducing the two of you up here? Why are you even here? And as you tell us about that, tell us about your organizations and the story from your work. Tell us how and why you have worked together.
Sure.
So I'll start off. My name is Susan Jane Brown. I'm a staff attorney for the Western Environmental Law Center. I'm based here in Portland, but I do spend a good chunk of my time out in Eastern Oregon, so I am sort of bi-Cascadian. I am an environmental attorney. I'm a litigator. I spend time in federal court challenging predominantly federal timber sales, mostly on national forest lands. So I'm a tree hugger by training. That's what I do on a regular basis. And that's sort of the reason why I'm here. And so I want to share a little story about how that came to be, and then Mark can correct me where I'm wrong.
I love cutting trees.
He loves cutting trees. I'm a tree hugger. So like I said, I'm a litigator, and I do challenge federal timber sales in court, and I had been doing that successfully for a number of years for conservation clients, so groups like the Sierra Club or Klamath-Siskiyou Wildland Center, small groups, large groups, all different kinds of conservation organizations. And in the early 2000s, that was like shooting fish in a barrel, frankly. It was pretty easy to challenge timber sales in court and be successful, and I had a client base that was interested in what was going on in Eastern Oregon. They were particularly concerned about the overharvest of old growth that had been happening for a number of decades leading up to the early 2000s. And so they were really focused on what was going on, not only on the west side of the Cascades with the spotted owl, but also on the east side of the Cascades where we don't have owls, we have other critters. And that litigation of mine had been highly successful. And what had happened was I was focusing on the Malheur National Forest, which is it's east of Bend and in Grant and Harney County, so sort of in that southeastern chunk of the state. That litigation had been highly successful to the point where there was really no timber program anymore on the Malheur, because I had challenged a bunch of sales and got a bunch of injunctions from a federal district court judge. And so there just wasn't a lot happening on the forest. And frankly, at the time, that was exactly what my clients were after. That was their intention, was to stop that from happening, stop the timber harvest. I was at a meeting here in Portland, and one of Mark's former colleagues approached me at that meeting. He was a county commissioner and said, you know, look, this really is not working for my community. Your litigation has shut us down, and it's really strangling my community. And so I want you to come see what that looks like. So would you be willing to come out to my community and spend a couple days with us out in the forest? And I'll take you out there, and I'll even bring you back. And maybe we can, you know, have a conversation about what your clients want, what we want as a community, and how we really think that there is a better way to manage our national forest than doing it through judicial decree, because that was what was happening at the time. And I think that was an incredibly brave and bold thing to do, frankly, and took me a little bit off guard, but I said, sure, I'd be happy to go out there with you. I did take some backup, but it was a great trip, and I spent a couple days out in the woods talking to people with very different views from my own about forest management and how directly connected forest management was with these rural communities. And so out of those early conversations grew our organization, the Blue Mountains Forest Partners. So I think I'll turn it over to Mark, and Mark can share with you his perspective of that, because he was one of those other people that I had to talk to.
Yeah, so as a community member. So Mark Webb, Executive Director for Blue Mountains Forest Partners. Blue Mountains Forest Partners is a diverse group of stakeholders who work together to create and implement a shared vision to improve the resilience and well-being of forests and communities in Eastern Oregon. For us, those are really tied together. That mission statement came some years down the road, and that's what I'm going to talk to very briefly at first, because it was really challenging. And yeah, so I came into this about 2006 when I ran for office. Commissioner Britton, the person that took you to the woods and brought you back, had encouraged me to run for office. I was elected to county judge in Grant County, and just to appreciate the context, I think it's really important. Grant County, almost as large as Connecticut, now approximately has 7,200 people, so it is rural. Very few people, large geographically. It's rough country. Federal land ownership and management amounts to about 63% of the county. And so what I want you to think about is just if you're on this campus, if you're in Portland, you're in some other city, just take 63% of whatever that is that you depend on economically off the table. Take 63% of the federal interstate system off the table, the ports and stuff like that. That's not something that we can survive. And that's what it was for us. SJ and her group and others had been really effective litigating and shutting down public land management. And for me, it's not an issue of whether that was appropriate or inappropriate. When I entered office, what was our option? We couldn't win in court. We were losing the most significant economic component to our livelihoods. So we had to do something different. And so when people ask me, I say status quo was unacceptable. We couldn't manage the public lands and we couldn't engage in the way that we did in the past. So we had to start working with people like SJ who were shutting us down. And it's really difficult. There's an enormous amount of distrust. You've interrupted our lives. You've compromised our families. It's just challenging. But we made that choice because we didn't have an alternative. And it was 3 difficult years of developing relationships with people you don't like initially and think that you could never understand. 3 hard years of doing that, coming to understand where they're coming from and why they're coming from that position, beginning to embrace that, maybe not agree with it, but understanding that these are individuals with legitimate interest, asking the question, how do we work together? Again, 3 years before we had our first project. After that, things started to ramp up because we had developed that trust, that understanding. We were able to take risks with one another. You were risking a lot to talk and advocate for active management given your constituents. It was incredibly hard for the environmental community. It was hard for my community. I think one thing that was key that I come back to is we started asking, what does the landscape need? This was a heavily managed landscape, fire suppression for well over a century. It needed a whole lot of work in order to be healthy, resilient, those kinds of things. Asking that question, getting the right kind of scientific information to inform those conversations is in part what allowed us to come together, because instead of talking to one another, we started to focus out and ask again, what does that landscape need? How do we meet its needs, and how do we accommodate our own interests, our own needs, and having that other stakeholder really present that can't talk for itself? That's what we did. And so developing those relationships, asking some different questions, taking risks and moving forward, developing a relationship with the Forest Service, I would add. At the time, that's probably the only thing we agreed on. We both hated the Forest Service. But they're another player with responsibilities embedded in a legal and legislative framework that can't be ignored, and so an important partner, and we all had to reconfigure what it was to relate in that public lands context in a way that affected our county and your interests. And so those are some of the steps. Since then, we've been designated a collaborative forest landscape restoration area. That means a lot of extra federal dollars coming to our county as a result of our collaborative, other partner collaboratives, and the Malheur working together. Restoration is occurring on a scale that's incredible. It's saved our timber industry. It's also serving to diversify the timber industry. What I talk about in terms of diversifying the value for the same resources were there. In the past, it was just timber. Now it's timber and biomass, figuring out how to add additional value to that. We're taking those steps. So it's been pretty remarkable in terms of developing a working relationship with people that we wouldn't normally have sat down with and probably didn't think that we could stand before. But our public lands engagement is much broader. It's much more inclusive. When I talk about the local collaborative, it is because SJ and other environmentalists from West Side urban areas are participating in our public lands effort. So that conversation is much more robust, much more reflective of the public at large. And yeah, it's been effective.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And Tony, from Idaho, tell us about the Salmon Valley Stewardship, and emphasize some of the assets that you had to work with and you continue to have, but also things that you've been able to bring in your work.
Okay, well, I wanted to thank the Aspen Institute and Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition for giving me the opportunity to be here to share some stories from rural Idaho. Maybe as a start, I just wanted to see a show. How many people know where Salmon, Idaho is? Yeah, wow, all right. I thought I'd set the stage just a little bit. When I wake up in the morning, I get to look out my window at the Beaverhead Mountains, which has the Continental Divide. I can look to the west and across the Salmon River towards across the Salmon River Valley, and I look at the kind of over the hills at the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, which is our largest wilderness area in the continental United States. We're a very isolated community. We like to say that it's 150 miles in any direction to the nearest Starbucks or Walmart. And that's either up to Missoula or down to Idaho Falls. We're typically have had a economic-driven community based on timber. We've seen a reduction over the years so that we've had jobs disappear. We're also seeing our demographics changing in the region. So we're an aging community at this point. We've got a retirement community situation. I think our median age is around 50. I think in the state we're #1 for a population over the age of 65. So we've seen quite a few changes, including young people that have been leaving. So the opportunity for our youth has just changed with that changing landscape relative to jobs, natural resource jobs. Our landscape, I should share out, is 92 and 96% public lands within 2 communities, and we have a population of about 12,000 between those 2 communities. So that equates to about 1 person per square mile. Before I arrived in Salmon, which was in 2005, just these challenges around this change in the job structure in the community, as well as just federal lands management, there was a group of people that coalesced to have these deep conversations and really try to get together to come and find common ground on how to address the challenges. In addition to the disappearing jobs, we had a wolf reintroduction that had just recently occurred on the landscape, which was a big challenge for some people, not knowing what that was gonna look like. And these changing federal policies as well as changing global markets that really influenced the timber economy. And then I would say one of the biggest catalysts was just the wildfire that happened. There was a huge wildfire in 2000 that started in the Frank Church Wilderness and blew up, so that started on July 10th. It came out of the wilderness towards communities. There was a lot of smoke, and that lasted for about 3 months and burned over 200,000 acres. With that, this group of people just sat down to really say, how can we have some civil dialogue? And I think the question on the table at that point was really around how do we leave a legacy of vibrant communities as well as healthy lands, healthy water, and resources for our kids that we want to be able to live here and for future generations. The area is heavily agriculture. I think 65% of our forested landscape is rangelands, and then we have a lot of BLM lands in that landscape, which is also rangelands, and then the private lands along the valley bottom. And people just really wanted to be able to tackle these issues and think about future generations, what they wanted to leave for their kids. I think one of the ranchers, for me, described it as I wake up in the morning and really think about how to balance the needs of our older generation with the needs of the younger generation and really wanting to focus on what we leave in place. Salmon Valley Stewardship kind of grew out of that broad collaborative in 2005. And we've been working to promote a sustainable economy and productive working lands since that time. We helped in 2006 get folks to the table again in this collaborative space for the forest restoration, and to talk about that, we formed the Lemhi Forest Restoration Group. And I'd say one of the innovations that came out of that group was just kind of how to push the boundaries with some of the forest policy relative to how we get people to be the connective tissue for stewarding the land, but also create jobs around that restoration opportunity. And one of the things the group did at that time was really ask the Forest Service to use best value criteria instead of low bid for their contractors. And this was a game changer in terms of one of the organizations that were contractors that put in for that being a guide and outfitter who really had a difficult situation of bridging the gap between his season, his spring hunt season, his fall fall season hunt, and keeping people working on the ground. So he got that contract and provided jobs for 7 folks who learned grubby chainsaw work, and we were able to infuse the economy at that time with that project. And I just want to provide that as one of the examples.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, and we're kind of getting back on our time track. So, thanks for sharing a bit of the stories. And again, I'm going to ask a few questions to kind of really seed and maybe dig a little bit deeper into some of these stories, maybe, and then try to bring some broader themes. But also, again, we're going to have some time for you all to ask questions in the audience, and then we'll take some questions from the live stream with the Twitter hashtag Rural Innovation. So the theme of this panel and this event here is tension as catalyst, and I think everything that each of your stories really has embedded within it a variety of tensions driven by legal policy conflicts, demographic and economic changes, and those kinds of things that really kind of prompted people to come together to figure out a new way. I mean, each of those really kind of, each of your stories really drew that out. And I want to just dive a little bit more into what are the assets and resources that each of you were able to draw upon. So it's obviously key individuals that reached out to make that change, but what were some of these other assets within the community, within perhaps government or philanthropic resources were available that really helped you get going? Billy, do you want to start off with that?
Sure. So assets and resources that brought us together, really for us it was our tribal council deciding, let's sit down with the local governments especially. I mean, we're already having to work with the state and federal governments because of the treaty rights issues and all, but it was really the local community and sitting down because, settler and indigenous communities don't often come together. And they literally did just that. So there wasn't any really outside resources. It was like, let's sit down, let's have a cup of coffee, and figure this out. And it's really successful in that respect. But the other resources that helped the community organize a little more formally were, frankly, the tribe. And we used a lot of tribal funding to facilitate the local collaborative, staff it. We have a lot of the scientists that work for the tribal government that therefore provide the information to the community. So it wasn't really outside resources for us. It was more inside
you already
resources.
had.
Yeah.
What about Blue Mountain Forest Partners?
Well, I'm sure Mark will talk about this as well, but Billy's point about facilitation is pretty important. Having a third-party neutral facilitator was pretty key to our work early on. And it wasn't for Forest Service facilitation either, and I think that's also pretty key because the Forest Service is often perceived as having a position. So having a third-party neutral, in our case it was Sustainable Northwest, came in and provided facilitation to start having some of these difficult conversations within the community and among stakeholders was really critical. Other assets that have also been really critical for our work include bringing external and internal science to the table. We have a lot of, initially, and even still to this day, we have a lot of avid conversations about why does the forest look this way? What can we do to fix it and make it better? And when you have a bunch of different stakeholders coming together, everybody's got their own opinion about what that answer is. And we have found that bringing science to the table allows for stakeholders to have a common dialogue or a common set of words and phrases and concepts that we can use to talk about what we are seeing in the forest and also what we're seeing in our community as a result. So we can talk about heterogeneity and fire return intervals and all that kind of good stuff where, a decade ago, we wouldn't have had that common language to talk about what we were seeing or how we talk about how we fix it. So, yeah, we're going to talk about which trees to cut and how often to put fire back in and whether or not we fence our aspen treatments. All of that kind of stuff are fairly elevated scientific concepts that we didn't have the wherewithal to really discuss prior to bringing that to the table. So I would say that bringing science and a third-party neutral facilitation team has been really critical to our success.
Yeah, I would echo that, and I would just say in addition that maybe not a resource per se, but it was absolutely critical that we got out on the ground to have conversations instead of just having these conversations around a table in a room. Actually look at what we're talking about. We can ask people, what do you see when we market this way? And a lot of times you would find out that there wasn't as much difference, say, between an environmental or conservationist on the one hand and industry on the other, but the language was different if you just stayed in there, so it was really important to get out as well.
Yeah, I would add that I didn't answer the question appropriately before, but one of our biggest assets really is the local knowledge. The people grew up here. They live, work, and play on the ground, and the extensive knowledge that you can bring into the room, even though the interests can be a little bit different, getting all that knowledge into a room is really powerful. One of my examples is having a conversation recently with some folks around wild and scenic rivers, and somebody in the room saying, well, I know why that's dubbed, this particular segment is dubbed an intermittent stream because it goes underground here and it pops up over here. That kind of knowledge in the room is something you just can't bottle.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I want to, there's sort of a common theme about building local institutions, right? Each of you are in kind of community-based intermediary organizations and those kinds of things. So I think there's something kind of a theme, but I wanted to come back to Mark Haggerty and looking at some of the larger patterns across the West. Each of the stories that are here are coming from what you're calling the Third West, right? Kind of isolated, not really connected to urban areas and kind of the kind of growth. So, you know, can you tell us a little bit then how you kind of see these changes in this broad economy across the West and how they are connecting, or how the work that we're hearing in these more the Third West is connecting to that, and what are kind of the systems that are in place that are facilitating that, and what's inhibiting that? And you mentioned a little bit in terms of the fiscal policy. I was wondering if you can dive deeper into that.
Yeah, so I've gotten to work with a bunch of collaboratives around the West, not as a facilitator, but as kind of an independent data broker. So we've been invited in to help them understand what's happening in their economy and help them look at some different scenarios based on their goals. And we did that with the Clearwater Basin Collaborative in Central Idaho. And one of the things that came out right away was the payments from the Forest Service were dependent on a revenue sharing arrangement or appropriations from Congress on an annual basis to bail them out. And neither one of those was going to be a long-term solution for these communities. And the county commissioners at the table said, you know, we would like to be a part of this collaborative, and we'd like to talk about new wilderness designations, and we want to get some more timber management done in the front country, but we can't do any of that if we can't meet our basic budget needs. And so the collaborative took them seriously, and we were able to provide some research and some resources to try to find some solutions. And ultimately, we came up with a proposal that is now has been introduced by Senator Crapo in Idaho and Senator Wyden in Oregon to fundamentally change the nature of the relationship, the fiscal relationship, from an annual revenue sharing to an endowment model. So we're starting to build wealth in these communities from the extraction of natural resources, stabilize those payments, and give these communities more flexibility, more certainty to try to solve these problems. And so the way that I see it working on the landscape is that the local communities understand the problems. They understand the challenges that they're facing. And if you can work with them to forward solutions, then the real goal is to try to get those solutions up to the next level and change the nature of the rules so that you can translate Tony's stories into the Blue Mountains and onto the Kootenai Reservation, right? And so that process, I think, comes through these networks and these supportive institutions like RVCC and like the Aspen Institute that can really grow these things and influence policy at a higher level.
Yeah. So taking that and then, you know, kind of coming back to this, your local community institutions, I want to kind of root the, you know, there's a lot of like just getting together and coming to agreement and working together as a group, and then there's both the land stewardship and restoration side, but then there's this dynamic of community development. And I kind of want to root some of the work that you're doing, and how does your story relate to that aspect? How are the conversations around community development changing, and what are the manifestations of that change that you're seeing?
Talk about Tour of Action.
Okay, I will. So, again, Grant County, public lands dependent, natural resource dependent county, needs federal lands. The timber industry is doing fine. Loggers have work, unlike a lot of counties. Because of the contract mechanisms that the Forest Service is using, the wages are actually higher. We're not suffering the same kind of stagnation you might see from that kind of employment that you would in other places. So that's an important thing to think about. But one of the things that's really critical is the diversification. I talked earlier about adding value to stuff that essentially didn't have value. Because of work going on the Malheur U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Families is considering a substantial investment in a torrefaction plant because of the stability of the biomass that currently doesn't have a value. And so investing in that kind of infrastructure, trying to develop additional markets to take that torrefied material really opens up additional opportunities for us in the county and on the landscape. And those are ways in which our work is tiered to other sorts of things going on, the market more broadly, diversifying, and community development.
So thinking about that question a little bit more. So at Kootenai Tribe, you know, we have a casino, and that brings revenue into the tribe, of course, but we also have all of our other government funding. So what the tribe's goal is of course to restore the resources, and what community goals are to have healthy economics, healthy communities, healthy citizens. And so I think what was important for us to do, because, you know, while I think most of the territory could be described as timber and ag dependent, at least our portion of the territory in North Idaho and Northwest Montana is really government dependent. You know, our tribal government and enterprises are probably one of the larger employers, I think we're about 12% of the economy. So but we've created more of a restoration economy that goes along with that. And it's important to do that not just so that you have restoration forestry, because that can't be the only goal, but to do restoration ridgetop to ridgetop is the tribe's goal, and do it in such a way that you're not threatening folks' livelihood. And one story that I just love and I think is amazing is there's a rancher in the territory, a settler, and he had a riparian area that we really wanted fish restoration, and it was important, I think, for kokanee. And so we suggested to him that we would you know, fence off the riparian area, and of course he legitimately said, well, cattle need water, what am I supposed to do? And so it's a very simple thing, but you put a small pipe into a trough and then back into the creek, fence it off, he has constantly flowing water, he gets cattle. And you know, it was interesting to talk to this gentleman, because he said, well, wait, you know, my grandpa settled the valley here. He took me fishing on this stream. I haven't been able to fish. I've got grandkids and I can't take them fishing. You mean to say that for very little money, you get restoration, I get to keep my livelihood, and eventually I can take my grandkid fishing? We said, yeah, that's how it works. It's really can be as simple as that. So it's doing restoration and doing the work that we as governments need to do to restore the species, but doing so that doesn't say, you know, kind of like the old fight, we're going to just put the timber industry out of business, or we're going to put ag producers out of business. There's a different way of doing it. You just have to think a little bit outside the box.
Yeah, I think similarly, it's that restoration economy, which helps spur the rural development in our communities. And it's not just the restoration work on the ground, the active restoration work. We've been able to tap into some of the funding that allows us to fill a gap in the monitoring that the agencies can't kind of get done, whether it's for rangeland permits or sage grouse monitoring or aspen monitoring or even some of the post-treatment work that happens through the active restoration. And we're able, as an organization, to provide jobs now. It's been for over 40 young people, young adults who are interested in that type of work and developing skills. We also look to, again, bring in our local youth so that they see a future in that opportunity. And that's one of the key places where, we see rural development going. One of the tensions that we have in the community is just that tie to you can create jobs, but how do you get people to stay or bring them to your community if you don't have the education system in place, healthcare, and then we're also struggling with affordable and available housing. So those are still some of the areas that we're trying to focus with our communities to develop better so that when we do create jobs, there's a way to get people to fill them and stay.
Great. Can I follow up on that real quick? Sorry, I'm a government official, and so I've got to jump in with some of these things. But I love that story about a collaborative filling in the gaps with monitoring, because we governments do a very good job about complaining that we don't have budgets, which we don't have big enough budgets. We are overworked, which we are. But we oftentimes fight constantly amongst each other, do redundant work, like some of the work that the tribe is doing. There was one forest project where the Forest Service hired a wildlife biologist that was outside the territory when we have 2 biologists working on it from the tribe, about 2 or 3 from the state. So if we can get the governments working together more and understanding what each other does and assisting one another, we can do so with less budget, less staff overload, and especially when we involve the community. By working together, we can actually accomplish what we are legally required to accomplish in the tribal, state, and federal governments. So it's partnerships like that that I think are the only way we're actually going to really comply with our own legal requirements.
Yeah, what I'm hearing too is then your organizations really create a space. So
right.
Your organizations are innovations of themselves, and in doing so, you're creating the space for other innovations by tapping into local knowledge, youth. You're also a magnet for resources, and that can help stack investments and those kinds of things. And then you have regional groups like RVCC and Sustainable Northwest that can also provide that assistance. But let me kind of then look to the other side. What is kind of standing in the way of kind of systems that are still in place that you feel like you're still bumping up against that are kind of inhibiting your progress?
Sure, I'll take that. Why is everyone looking at me? The lawyer in the room? You're a lawyer too, I'll look at you. So I guess the way that I would answer that question is, frankly, with a debate term. So I was a debater in high school and college, and now I'm a lawyer, so I'm in that frame. And when we talk about policy change, we talk about barriers. If you've got the idea, you've got the silver bullet, how come that issue or that idea hasn't been implemented to fix that problem in the past? Sometimes that's funding. There's just not enough money in the world to pay for that. Sometimes you've got a statute, so you've got some legal framework thing that's in the way. But there's also this attitudinal inherent barrier to implementing good ideas. And that really stands for this concept of there's just a lot of human inertia, and there's just a lot of resistance to change because change is hard. And I think that that's frankly what stands in a lot of our ways is, yeah, sure, there's a complex legal framework out there, and if it was different, maybe it would be easier. Or if there was more money in the world, sure, that would help us and that would make things a lot easier to fix. But frankly, what we're mostly dealing with is the human opposition and unwillingness to change, because the old way of doing things, the status quo, is easier. We know what that stands for. We know how to operate in the status quo, even if it doesn't get us what we want. And so there's a lot of opposition to change. And when we talk about forest ecology and restoration on the Malheur, we really talk about it not so much as in we don't have the science or the technology to help fix these problems on the landscape or even in the community. Really what we're talking about is a social problem. We're talking about people, and anytime people get involved, things get really sticky and really challenging, and that gets back to these relationships. And so really, I think what stands in our way more than anything else is just this inherent unwillingness to change. And that takes time to overcome. And that's why for Blue Mountains Forest Partners, we've been working together for more than 17 years, which is a really long time to be doing any one thing with any one group of people, other than your family, right? I mean, who do you know longer than you've known your family or your spouse? Well, in my case, it's my collaborative partners. And we're still working on it. And so I think it's that it's difficult to change, and having relationships make that easier. But relationships are a work in progress, and they don't happen overnight. It takes years to really be able to trust people and to want to help them succeed. So that's how I would answer that question.
Good. Anybody else want to jump on?
Yeah, I'd add, the one size fits all doesn't work so well. We've got folks in our landscape who have some really innovative ideas. I look to some of the ranchers who talk about what happens post-fire on the land, and that their allotment, if that fire came through their allotment, they have to rest for 2 growing seasons. So there's some innovations that they've developed in terms of thinking about working together and developing these grass banks. But there's constraints on, how you have your animals situated on the land and when you can move them. So just having some of those flexibilities built in that allow people to innovate, test new ideas, and then again, follow up with some sort of monitoring where you can look at the outcome, and that one size doesn't necessarily fit all, so there's some constraints in terms of the policy.
Okay. Bill, you want to add anything? Or?
No, I think that covers it. And I agree with SJ. It's a lot of it is that it's not how we've done things, and that attitude that prevents you from doing things differently, which is what we need to do, because like Mark said earlier, the status quo was unacceptable. It continues to be unacceptable. We have to continue to innovate. We have to continue to do more. And one of the things, I know Susan, Jane, and I have talked a lot about this, but one thing that impacts that is while you have the stability of the tribal government and the local governments, a lot of times with the federal government especially, and to a lesser extent with state government, it's a constant changing sea of faces that come and work with you. And that has a big impact on our ability to go out into the forest and work collaboratively because, you just get a good relationship with one federal official, then they're off to their next posting, and a new person comes in and just at times has to really even learn the community. And I think the federal agencies are getting better about it, but there's still the fact of federal employment means if you want to move up in your career, you have to move on.
Yeah, the turnover, and that affects those relationships, obviously. Definitely. So I'm wondering if we might want to open it up to some questions from the floor here and over the live stream. So we have a couple of microphones that are located here, and I want to do this. You want to just raise your hands and then walk around the room? And...
No, mine's on.
Yours is on, Karen.
Sorry. Do we have a question from this side of the room? Or?
they're all on this side.
We can probably hear you, too.
But we want to make sure that folks on the live stream hear it.
Hi, I'm Charlie Manger. I grew up in Seattle, but I've done a ton of work in 53 different countries, principally emerging countries in lots of rural areas. What's really interesting to me was I spend most of my time overseas and seeing countries deal with these issues. And there's some places that are kind of top-down, like Japan and even China. And while I first went there, it was very communist in '91. When I went back in 2005, it had all the efficiency of more of a managed economy. It was like strategy was top-down, but execution was out in the field, which is where I was. But I had a playbook I could go to and look at and see what they care about and where it prioritizes. And it was always localized what was available to those people. And I was totally amazed by it. But I'm sitting in China one day and I see the election occurring and I see all this stuff happening in rural America, and I realized we could use some of those tools here. and I meet really smart institutes, people that have been at this for decades, and I wonder how many of us are looking outside our country for maybe agrarian societies or people that are just jumping into the knowledge economy to see what kind of tools and templates there might be. Particularly a place, this is going to sound really weird, but I'm an entrepreneur and it's way easier to work in China than it is here. And I'm now trying to do some things in rural America that bring know-how, technology, and capital out there. So I'm so excited about this conversation you guys are having. But my question in that roundabout way is, do you guys ever get a chance to get out of the office or like even out of the woods here and maybe come visit us in Ishikawa over in Japan or maybe in Sichuan province of China?
Great question.
So no, we go into British Columbia and Alberta. It is a different country, technically. But we do, with a lot of the things we do, not speaking to kind of the innovation you're talking to, but we do have a, the Brain Trust. University of Idaho, we provide them a lot of research funding. University of British Columbia is another one, UC Davis. So we rely on those universities to kind of do the research as to what else occurs in the world, and that is then fed back into us.
And we'd love to, but we need a grant or some sort of funding. So, our organization looks for funding from federal partners as well as stitching together with grants, individual donors. And most of that funding that we get is targeted for on-the-ground work. That's where they want the funding to go. There's less funding available to do the collaboration. And that's where we just tap into the resources. Our organization has supported a lot of the collaboration in our communities just based on our general operations. So where we do try to tap in is this networking with Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition. We're also part of something called the High Divide Collaborative in our region. And by networking with other people, at least regionally, we're able to better understand what some of those templates are or how we can tap into changing policies or utilize authorities that might work in our landscape.
I think there's actually something really important about that question, and we have a lack of kind of national policy or even state policy in a lot of these realms. And in some, there's a tension because sometimes collaboration is used as a way to kind of abdicate and shift off responsibility from the need for any kind of regional or national coordination. And we've been doing a lot of work in energy, which is also collaborators in Australia in particular. And in the 70s, when we had an energy crisis, we had a national energy policy driven by the Carter administration. We had incredible regional coordination across the West to build the most extensive interconnected grid in the country, fueled by all these major investments in coal-fired power plants, mine-mouth power plants, to basically power the Western US. And since then, we've had energy deregulation, we've had a tax revolt, and now these communities are losing their coal mines and their power plants, and they're alone. There's no national policy, there's no transition space where this is happening. And we could learn some lessons from what we did, not only from what other countries have done, but what we used to do in the past. And take the lessons on the ground, but inform it and support it with regional and national policy and planning.
I will add too that some of the early days of this community-based natural resource management, linking land stewardship with rural communities, was instigated by people from the Ford Foundation that came back from their duties internationally and brought a lot of those ideas and found a lot of already gardens to plant those seeds. So there's been a history, but their involvement has kind of come and gone.
Question in a technical sense. We've seen the battles over the years, and you've actually been in the battles of no logging, which has hurt so many communities, and then clear cutting, which the environmental side we mostly don't want. But there's a selective timber, the thinning of the forest that we hear from our professors has to be done, whether it's in your backyard or out in a national forest. What is the cost differential? Clear cutting is $100, is it $150 to go in and start to thin out and kind of weave your way through? What is that percentage of cost, to actually just do it the right way, the thinning out rather than the clear cutting? And on the other side of the coin, once we learn a little bit about the cost, Is cross-laminated timber the way to go for all or any of you? Because we hear it hard here in the region. And I think a lot of us are excited about it, maybe getting more folks to work and getting a little bit more environmental construction methods.
You want to do the cost?
No, you're going to do the cost. You're the logger.
Well, we don't do clear cut in Eastern Oregon. So clear cutting is more cost effective from our perspective, our conversation. We've actually attempted to have a conversation clear cutting with lots of scare quotes around there for people like SJ. So I say that in this sense, for us, we really are asking, again, what does the landscape need and what kind of treatment would that involve? And that might involve what looks like smaller clear cuts, just because of the need for the initial harvest stands, the young growth and things for wildlife and stuff like that. So we think about cost, particularly from the loggers, what they need to make that work, or what it costs the Forest Service to provide in addition to what the loggers need to make that work. But that's not the primary consideration for us anymore. It is primarily about what does that landscape need and how do we make that work for our communities. So those things are strongly tiered, and then that's when we start to ask about some of the additional costs and stuff. It does mean that a lot of work that we think is needed is not getting done because there's not enough funding for it, because there's not enough commercial wood that can come off to cover that cost. So.
Yeah, and I think, so we believe on the east side in what's called variable retention harvest. It's patchy, so you're thinning some trees over here, you're taking groups of trees over here, those are the small clear cuts, to really restore the mosaic pattern of forest cover and restore the species composition of tree out there. You know, out on the east side, we've got mostly ponderosa pine, some larch, but what we've had, because of fire suppression, is an encroaching fir catastrophe. We've got fir all over the place that we didn't used to have in the amount that we do now. And so we got to get rid of that stuff. And we've removed a lot of the big old growth ponderosa pine and larch. So we have very little old growth left out there. And so the stuff that needs to come out is typically lower value. And so to treat an acre is fairly expensive. It can be $600, $700, $800 an acre to do everything that needs to be done. That means taking out the small trees. That means taking out some of the larger fir that don't belong. That means burning it. Sometimes you're going to fence an aspen restoration area so we don't have ungulates in there. And all that stuff is expensive, particularly the low value material. And that's where the torrefaction facility in John Day comes in, because we're talking about small diameter stuff that you cannot really turn into a 2x4. So what do you do with that stuff? Well, it either gets burned at the landing, somebody piles it and you light a match, or it gets burned up in a forest fire. And so if we can not do that and put it through a facility that then adds value to that product, basically creates briquettes, torrefactions like coffee roasting, so it creates briquettes that then can be shipped to Asia, mostly Japan, for consumption. So we're looking for value-added ways to make that stuff pay its way out of the woods, because otherwise, generally speaking, we don't have a lot of merchantable material left in the forest. It's either been logged before or it's been burned. And so we've got to find a way to add value to that material, and that's where CLT comes in. Cross-laminated timber is, if it works, that's going to be a boon, because it is smaller diameter material. You can basically glue it together and it becomes this structurally very sound material. And if we can do that in a way that's environmentally sensitive, not only getting it out of the woods and manufacturing it, because there is a manufacturing process that has some chemicals that are involved, but if we can control for those emissions, then it has a lot of potential, and it's very exciting. And hopefully that will work, but we'll see if the market will bear that cost.
And I would say it'd be a complement to the existing mill structure. It wouldn't take its place.
Right, yeah.
So we have a question from Twitter. We do, right here, on paper, however.
One of our listeners wants to know, and it's kind of on this trade in the conversation that you're having here, is whether or not timber receipts and the jobs and markets associated with restoration forestry, which you've all talked a lot about, is enough to grow your rural economy. And if it's not, what else is needed?
No. Yeah, it's a really complicated question and issue. I mean, Mark's spoken to that pretty nicely. So rural communities like I'm familiar with, Eastern Oregon, timber dependent, resource dependent, large federal presence. In the past, we had some of the highest GDPs in the country because of the timber coming in. We don't have that anymore. You won't generate, because we did overcut, there's no doubt about it. 4, 5, 6 mills going on in a small community like that, we overcut. So you're not going to restore the economy in that way. It's just not going to happen. You don't have the natural resources to do it. The counties, I don't think, and this is me speaking as a past county judge just for myself, the timber receipts will never, at least for east side counties, will be the same. And we have to figure out how to live with that. And the feds need to see if they can reconfigure something and how we can reallocate resources or opportunities, not to scale us up to where we were in the past, but to what it is to be a flourishing community in that landscape. And those are the kind of conversations we've been having that I wish we could have with the state and the feds. And so the simple answer is no, but it's a really complicated issue because it's just not a matter of cutting more timber and getting dollars for them. You could cut more timber now, but the market's down, for example. There's just a host of things, and it would be great to have a conference on that and just really hard, honest conversations with people who realize can't go that way anymore. What are our options? How do we reconfigure the conversation? So I don't think so to the person.
So I have two questions that have come in from the Twitter that are both definitional. So I'm going to ask them together, and then we're going to take another question from the room after that. So one is, what does restoration forestry mean, and what is it replacing? And the other is, what is torrefaction?
You did a good job.
I'll take torrefaction. So torrefaction is roasting. It's basically taking biomass, in this case, small diameter trees that are chipped, and then roasting those chips. And that roasting process is called torrefaction.
Think of roasting coffee beans.
Roasting coffee beans is essentially what it is. And then what you get at the end of that is a water repellent pellet, basically. So if you know what pellets are that go into stoves that then are combusted, this is essentially what that is. But they've been already roasted, they've been pre-roasted. And so they're already pretty hard, and you can, because they're water repellent, you can actually leave them out in the yard. You don't have to cover them, which is apparently an important thing for storage. And then those are burned like briquettes or like pellets.
Well, they're intended on a large scale to take the place of coal or to supplement coal. So to provide some kind of market for biomass that doesn't have any value right now, but as a substitute or a complement to coal, high BTUs, generally more environmentally friendly.
So that other question was, what is restoration forestry and what is it replacing? And then we'll turn to the room.
Yeah, again, I think that might be kind of a hard question for me. So
it's a test.
Yeah, well.
Let's see.
So I'm going to change it from what's actually happening on the ground, and I'll explain that in just a moment, to the perspective, the Forest Service perspective. Traditionally, in a timber-centric perspective, it is about getting the trees off the ground at the highest value and replanting for production forestry. It's tree farm on public lands, essentially. So what restoration, as we understand it, as we attempt to implement it, timber harvest is an integral part of that. And for us, timber harvest is not something different from restoration. It is the first step in restoration. It's the removal of commercially valuable, we hope, material. But that's a step towards shifting the species composition back to something that historically was more healthy and resilient for the landscape, reducing the basal area, thinning that understory out so that it can handle fires better, mitigate the effects of wildfire. And then it starts to have a hydrological effect as well. And so restoration for us is that timber approach to timber harvest that does that range of things.
So we'll do at least two questions from the room. There's one over here.
Thank you. A question having to do with moving beyond national policy, federal policy, to state policy. So let's let Susan and Mark focus on this one. there's a milieu of state agencies, everything from Department of State Lands and Business Oregon and the State Planning Program and a number of state agencies that have independent policies, laws, administrative rules, programs. How do those help or impair your capability to get to the kind of outcomes you want?
I would say that, frankly, there's not a whole lot of overlap between state law and state policy and federal law and federal policy. Even here in Oregon, where we do trees, like that's what Oregon does, that's what the Oregon Department of Forestry does. But even so, that legal and policy framework is very different on state lands than on federal lands. So there's not, frankly, a whole ton of overlap. There is potential, certainly, for partnership and shared stewardship. So like Billy was saying, in terms of, hey, the state has these wildlife biologists or hydrologists or planners, and the Forest Service doesn't necessarily have all of those people in the right place at the right time. So the state could share those resources with the federal government to help not only contribute to improving ecological conditions on the Forest Service side of the line, but also the state side of the line. So there is a federal policy and tools that do allow for federal payments to go to the state and for the state to actually do work on federal land and also on non-federal land. So there are those tools, and they're relatively new. We're still figuring out how to make those the most efficient way possible. But generally speaking, there's not a whole heck of a lot of overlap, and that may be part of the reason why you see such a difference in terms of how all the different land ownerships are managed.
Yeah, and I would just add, there's one way in which I see some impairment. Oregon Department of Environmental Quality regulates air quality. Oregon Health Authority appropriately is concerned with public health. Right now, there's a bit of a disconnect between how they view their responsibilities and the type of prescribed fire program we need to get on the ground. I think there's been movement there, but the regulatory component is not well aligned with the forest resource issue. So that's one example of a challenge that I think everybody's moving forward. Oregon Water Enhancement Board has done a lot of what we do in riparian areas. So you've got a state agency that's doing a lot of really good work in a way that goes to the community and tries to get their input. The one way in which I see the state and state agencies could complement these efforts, again, this is where I think we go. There's not enough thought given to how do we integrate our various state agency responsibilities with the federal agency responsibilities and local community needs and landscapes. If we had those conversations, which would be pretty hard because it gets risky for the agency folk to have them, then you would start to see some pretty remarkable momentum going in a pretty appropriate direction, I think.
So I think we might have time for one brief question from the audience and a brief response before we turn it to our closing speaker. Is there anyone else? There's a microphone.
So I wondered if we could hear you comment briefly on the demographics of your organizations. And the context for that is Tony made a comment early on about the rapid aging of the community. So having taken a look at similar issues on the west side in counties that are affected by the Northwest Forest Plan, you see that counties like Grant County with the highest proportion of federal lands and the greatest dependence historically on federal timber are the ones in which the age of population is accelerating the most rapidly and the workforce is shrinking. So with that in mind, thinking long-term about your communities, I'm wondering how the makeup of your organizations is trying to address the fact that most of the human capital in your communities is older. And to what extent have you been able to engage with younger elements in the community?
Yeah, so I don't mean to be dismissive. We're fortunate that most of the older population are older loggers. So by addressing restoration, we can re-engage that. I will say BMFP hasn't been particularly strong until over the last year. We've been veg-focused and project-focused, attempting to create the enabling conditions that allow work to go on at a pace and scale of the type that we feel like is important. Over the last couple years, we've started to develop a community outreach plan that is more, I think, tiered towards the community, many of which don't necessarily support our efforts because they don't understand those or they're at odds. The person leading that effort is working in the schools to develop natural resource curricula. So that's a nice step. I think one thing that I would like to see is where OSU Extension took a slightly different perspective about what their responsibilities might be for conservation of rural communities and started to integrate with this restoration economy, this restoration focus differently than what they have in the past. Those are some things that we're attempting to pursue. Yeah, one thing that also is probably helpful for us is that a lot of the harvest is mechanical and the equipment is high dollar, and there's a lot of younger folks that are coming back to the woods there because they like to work in it and it's stimulating, and there's those all kind of opportunities.
And I'd just add real quickly, in our landscape, because we're not timber heavy, we're looking at youngsters really wanting just to be out on the land recreating and tapping into that. So there's this real interest in getting around trails together and how we make connections better from our communities out to access to public lands. And so that's a growing place, perhaps. We have a couple new businesses that have developed around non-motorized and motorized recreation.
All right, I want to thank you all for coming here today, both those of you that are here at Portland State University and those live streaming. My name's Nils Christofferson. I'm the Executive Director of Willow Resources and a member of the RVCC leadership team, as well as a member of the Rural Development Innovation Group. I hope you enjoyed today's session. As you've heard, there's tremendous innovation occurring in the development of collaborative relationships and partnerships, stewardship contracting, forest restoration, and innovations in wood product development. All things that are creating a new value proposition for rural places, particularly rural places surrounded by our National Forest System lands. And this innovation is critical to embracing challenges as diverse as climate change, technological automation, and the need to sustain robust, resilient, and vital rural communities. Communities that have the knowledge and skills to respond to these challenges in ways that advance the dignity, health, and prosperity of everyone in the West. I'm also excited, getting back to your question, that this innovation creates new rural development models for the whole country, but also internationally and vice versa. As you've heard today, this success and the continued innovation requires several things. First, it requires new and durable relationships, including political, jurisdictional, scientific, and financial partnerships to leverage, scale, and replicate the examples you've heard about today and many others that are occurring across the West. It requires the flexibility to innovate, to take risks, assess outcomes, and continue to improve on our approaches to land stewardship, workforce development, and rural revitalization. And we can't dismiss strategies, individual efforts, because they may fall short at some point in time. They need to be given the time to continue to learn, to invest in continuous improvement. Investment in entrepreneurial local people, institutions, and firms is critical, not just hard infrastructure. Place-rooted, collaborative intermediary organizations are essential to successful rural community and economic development. And finally, it takes an appreciation that of the time. Everyone here has been deeply committed to this work for years. They've demonstrated remarkable persistence, patience, and commitment. Short-term investments will not yield the outcomes we're all seeking. In closing, I want to thank our collaborative stewardship action heroes, Mark, Billy, Susan Jane, Mark, Tony, and Tony. Thanks as well to Portland State University's Hatfield School of Government for serving as co-host and ensuring that there are spaces to think deeply and ensure that what is done in the field is rooted in evidence or the subject of scientific inquiry. I also want to thank Portland State University for their partnership with Eastern Oregon University through the Rural Urban Ambassadors Program. I want to thank Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition, which builds connective tissue among organizations and people across the West focused on aligning land stewardship and development to build a better West. And finally, I want to thank all my colleagues on the Rural Development Innovation Group for your partnership in organizing this series, and to the Aspen Institute's Community Strategies Group for its leadership. We know that a healthy and more prosperous America requires a healthy, resilient, and prospering rural America. And that won't happen without close attention to the range of innovation happening in rural and how it can be better supported and accelerated. Please stay tuned for our next Rural Opportunities Dialogue this fall that will focus on community foundations as hubs for rural innovation. For now, enjoy summer and remember to invest in rural America. Thank you very much.